A road of choices. The wind howled across the empty highway, a relentless force sweeping waves of snow into the night. The icy crystals clung stubbornly to Orson Blackwell's windshield, despite the wipers scraping tirelessly back and forth. His truck, a hulking, refrigerated beast hauling crates of produce and delicate wedding flowers, growled steadily as it carved through the blizzard. It was the kind of night where even the hardiest of souls preferred to stay indoors, safe from the bitter chill and unpredictable roads. Yet for Orson, this was just another day, another haul, another journey through a winter storm he was too used to fearing. Orson gripped the steering wheel with a practiced calm. The faint hum of country music played through the cab's aging speakers, though it barely registered in his mind. His focus was entirely on the dark road ahead, his thoughts a swirl of frustration and resignation. The call from his boss earlier had been the final sour note in an already long day. "Get there fast," his boss had barked. "I don't care what the weather looks like. Those flowers are non-negotiable." Non-negotiable. Orson had swallowed his irritation at the word. How often in the last 15 years had his own needs been deemed less important than the cargo he hauled? More times than he cared to count. He glanced at the dashboard. The temperature outside had dropped to a brutal -15 degrees Celsius. His hands tightened on the wheel, the sting of the cold seeping through even the truck's warm cab. His breath fogged faintly in the air as he muttered, 15 years of this. 15 years, and I'm still out here alone." The loneliness gnawed at him, but he pushed it down like he always did, burying it beneath layers of practicality and the numbness that came with routine. The thought of his wife and daughter, people he hadn't spoken to in years, flickered briefly in his mind before he shoved it away. Memories were useless out here, just ghosts haunting the rearview mirror. The road stretched on endlessly, the dark asphalt cutting a lonely path through fields that had long since disappeared beneath blankets of snow. The only other lights were the dim glow of his headlights, their beams struggling against the thickening storm. Orson considered pulling over at the next gas station, maybe grabbing some coffee to shake off the weariness creeping into his bones. But the delivery deadline loomed large in his mind. Stopping would mean risking the wrath of his boss, and Orson had already lost too much to take that gamble. His truck barreled forward, the tires crunching against the snow-covered road. Then, just as he crested a small hill, his headlights caught something unusual. A flicker of movement, a splash of color against the monotonous white. Orson squinted, his tired eyes narrowing as he focused on the shape. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, a phantom conjured by his exhaustion. But as he drew closer, the figure became clearer. A child, a little girl, no older than 10, stood at the edge of the highway, her arms waving frantically. She was dressed in a thin, pale blue dress, utterly unsuited for the freezing night, her hair whipped around her face, wild and untamed by the relentless wind. "What the hell?" Orson muttered, his foot instinctively lifting off the gas. The truck slowed slightly, and for a moment, Orson debated pulling over. But his mind raced with questions and doubts. Why was she out here? Was this some kind of trick? He'd heard stories of highway scams, people using children as bait to lure unsuspecting drivers into traps. The thought made his stomach churn. She could be in trouble, he muttered under his breath. But even as the words left his mouth, another voice, colder and more pragmatic, echoed in his mind. "Not your problem, Orson. Just keep driving." He glanced at the dashboard clock. He was already behind schedule. Stopping would only delay him further, and the boss had made it clear there'd be no second chances if he screwed this up. Still, as the truck rumbled past the girl, Orson couldn't help but glance in the side mirror. She stood there, her small figure shrinking into the distance, her arms still waving desperately. The guilt hit him like a weight in his chest, heavy and suffocating. Orson clenched his jaw and tried to focus on the road ahead. He turned up the radio, letting the twang of the music fill the cab, but it didn't drown out the nagging voice in his head. He gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white against the leather. "Not my problem," he repeated aloud, as if saying it would make it true. But the image of the girl, her trembling form, her frantic waves, stayed burned into his mind. 15 minutes later, the lights of a gas station appeared through the swirling snow, a faint beacon in the storm. Orson pulled into the lot, his truck groaning to a stop beside the fuel pump. He stepped out into the cold, the wind biting at his face and hands as he filled the tank. His movements were automatic, his mind still replaying the moment he passed the girl. Inside the station, the warmth was a welcome relief. Orson grabbed a cup of coffee and a pack of jerky, nodding absently at the cashier. As he waited to pay, he overheard two men talking near the restrooms. "Did you see that kid out on the highway?" one of them said. "Looked like she was freezing to death." "Yeah, I saw her," the other replied. "Didn't stop, though. Could be a trap, you know. These days, you can't trust anything." Orson felt a jolt of anger at their indifference, but it was quickly overshadowed by a deeper, more uncomfortable realization. He hadn't stopped either. He'd done the same thing they had, kept driving, convincing himself it wasn't his responsibility. The rest of the drive back to his truck was a blur. By the time Orson slid into the driver's seat, his hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the weight of his conscience. He stared at the road ahead, the swirling snow swallowing the horizon. For the first time in years, Orson felt truly unsure of what to do. Finally, he let out a long breath and muttered, "Screw it." Without another thought, he shifted the truck into gear and turned it around. The storm was worsening, the snow falling so heavily it was like driving through a white curtain. But Orson didn't care. He couldn't care. Not anymore. The girl's face loomed in his mind, her wide, terrified eyes pleading silently for help. Orson pressed down on the accelerator, his truck cutting back through the storm, the tires crunching over fresh snow. He didn't know what he'd find when he returned to that spot, or if he'd even find her at all. But he knew one thing. He couldn't leave her out there. Not tonight. Not ever. As the odometer ticked forward, and the road blurred into white, Orson whispered under his breath, a promise to no one but himself. "I'll find you. Just hold on." A frigid truth. Orson's truck plowed through the thick snow, its headlights casting narrow beams that barely penetrated the suffocating storm. The rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers was the only sound aside from the low hum of the engine and the pounding of Orson's heart. The blizzard had worsened, turning the highway into an icy, desolate wasteland. Each passing mile felt like an eternity, the urgency in his chest growing heavier with every second. The thought of the girl, her small, fragile figure shivering in the biting cold, was a haunting image he couldn't shake. Why had she been out there alone? Why wasn't anyone looking for her? Questions swirled in his mind like the relentless snow, but none of them mattered right now. All that mattered was finding her. The odometer climbed steadily, and Orson's grip on the wheel tightened. He kept scanning the road for that flash of color, that splash of pale blue that didn't belong in the sea of white. The landscape blurred together, snowflakes streaking across the windshield like shooting stars. Doubt began to creep in, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. What if she was gone? What if she'd wandered off into the fields, swallowed by the storm? What if he was too late? No, Orson muttered to himself, shaking his head as if to banish the thought. She's out there. I'll find her. 30 minutes of backtracking felt like hours, the storm slowing his progress to a crawl. But then, finally, he saw it, a faint blur of blue in the distance, barely distinguishable against the snow. His breath caught in his throat, and he pressed harder on the accelerator, the truck groaning in protest as it surged forward. As he drew closer, the blur sharpened into the unmistakable figure of the girl. She was huddled on the shoulder of the road, her thin arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her dress, now soaked and tattered, clung to her small frame, and her bare feet were half buried in the snow. She wasn't waving this time. She was just standing there, shivering violently, her head bowed as if she had given up hope. Orson slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding slightly before coming to a stop a few yards away. He threw open the door and jumped out, the icy wind hitting him like a slap to the face. His boots crunched against the snow as he hurried toward her, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Hey," he called out, his voice loud and firm to cut through the howling wind. "Are you okay?" The girl didn't respond. She didn't even look up. Orson's heart sank as he reached her, crouching down to her level. Up close, she looked even smaller, her pale skin flushed red from the cold. Her hair, a tangled mess of dark curls, clung to her face in wet strands. Her lips were a bluish tint, trembling as she struggled to breathe through the chill. "Hey, kid," Orson said more gently this time, his tone softening. "It's okay. I'm here to help." The girl finally looked up, her wide brown eyes meeting his. They were filled with a mix of fear and exhaustion, and something else. Something Orson couldn't quite place. Her lips parted, but no sound came out, only a faint, shaky exhale. She swayed slightly, as if her legs could no longer support her. Without thinking, Orson shrugged off his thick jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders. The fabric dwarfed her, but at least it offered some protection from the biting wind. He scooped her up in his arms, alarmed by how light she was, like holding a bundle of sticks. She didn't resist, simply resting her head against his chest, as if she no longer had the strength to fight. "Hang on, kid," Orson said, his voice gruff but steady. "You're gonna be okay. I promise." He carried her back to the truck, shielding her from the wind as best he could. Once inside, he cranked up the heat, letting the warm air blast through the vents. He placed the girl on the passenger seat, tucking her into the jacket like a makeshift blanket. She curled up instinctively, her small body shivering less as the warmth began to take hold. "Can you talk?" Orson asked, glancing at her as he reached for the thermos of hot coffee he'd bought at the gas station. He poured some into the lid and held it out to her. "Here, drink this. It'll help." The girl hesitated, her eyes flickering between the cup and Orson's face. Finally, she reached out with trembling hands and took the cup, sipping cautiously. Orson watched her closely, his mind racing. There were so many things he wanted to ask, but he didn't want to overwhelm her. She needed to feel safe first. After a few moments, the girl's shivering subsided enough for her to speak. Her voice was barely a whisper, fragile and trembling like the rest of her. "Thank you," she said, her eyes downcast. Orson nodded. "You're welcome. What's your name, kid?" She hesitated again, her fingers tightening around the cup. "Mia," she said finally. "Mia," Orson repeated, his tone steady and reassuring. "That's a nice name." "My name's Orson." She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from the cup. Orson waited, giving her time to gather her thoughts. After a long silence, she spoke again, her voice even quieter this time. "I ran away." Orson felt his stomach tighten. "Ran away? From where?" Mia didn't answer immediately. Her small hands trembled as she held the cup, and Orson realized it wasn't just from the cold. She was scared, terrified, even. He leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but firm. "Mia, listen to me. Whatever you're running from, I can help. But I need you to tell me the truth. Can you do that?" Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over and streaking down her flushed cheeks. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice broke, and she let out a quiet sob instead. Orson's heart ached at the sight. He reached out, resting a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay," he said gently. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you." Mia looked up at him then, her tear-filled eyes meeting his. Her lips quivered as she finally forced the words out. "He's coming for me," she whispered. "I have to hide." Orson's blood ran cold. "Who's coming for you, Mia?" She shook her head, clutching the cup tightly as if it were a lifeline. "He'll hurt me if he finds me." The weight of her words settled heavily in Orson's chest. He didn't know who this he was, but the fear in Mia's voice was unmistakable. Whoever she was running from, It wasn't just a misunderstanding or a childish tantrum. It was something much darker. Orson reached for his phone, his hand shaking slightly. He dialed 911, his jaw tightening as the operator's voice came through the line. "This is 911. What's your emergency?" Orson glanced at Mia, her small form curled up in the seat, her eyes filled with a desperation that tore at his heart. "I've got a little girl with me," he said, his voice firm. "She's in trouble. She needs help." As he gave the operator their location, Orson's mind raced. The storm raged outside, the snow piling higher with each passing minute. But inside the truck, a new storm was brewing, one that would test Orson in ways he never could have imagined. Shadows in the storm. The snowfall thickened as Orson sat in his truck, his phone pressed to his ear, the operator's calm voice guiding him through the necessary steps. Mia huddled in his jacket on the passenger seat, her small body barely visible under the heavy folds of fabric. She stared out the window, her wide, fearful eyes darting toward every shadow that the headlights caught in the swirling storm. "I've called for an officer to meet you," the 911 operator said. "They're on their way, but the weather is causing delays. Stay put and keep the child warm." Orson hung up with a heavy sigh, slipping the phone into his pocket. He turned his attention back to Mia, who was now trembling, not from the cold, but from a fear so deep it seemed to grip her entire being. She clutched the coffee cup like it was her last connection to the warmth of safety. "Hey, kid," Orson said gently. "They're sending help. You're gonna be okay." Mia didn't respond. Her gaze remained fixed on the storm outside, as if she expected something, or someone, to emerge from the darkness at any moment. Orson felt a twinge of unease. Whoever she was running from, her fear was palpable, almost infectious. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story than she'd let on. "What happened, Maya?" he asked after a moment. "Why were you out there on the highway? Who's he?" Her small hands tightened around the cup, her knuckles turning white. She didn't look at him, her voice barely audible above the hum of the truck's heater. He's bad," she whispered. "He hurt me." Orson's stomach twisted. The simplicity of her words hit him harder than if she'd given a detailed account. He didn't need specifics to understand the gravity of the situation. His mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. "Okay," he said carefully, trying to keep his voice steady. "Is he someone you know? Someone from your family?" Mia hesitated, her breath hitching. She glanced at him briefly, her tear-filled eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. "He's my uncle," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I ran away because he does bad things. I couldn't stay there anymore." Orson's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles turning white. He'd seen enough news stories and heard enough truck stop tales to know what bad things could mean. The thought of anyone hurting a child, especially someone who was supposed to protect them, made his blood boil. "You did the right thing, Mia," he said firmly. "Running away was brave. Now it's my job to make sure you're safe." Mia's lips quivered, and she nodded faintly, though her fear didn't lessen. She glanced at the window again, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the swirling snow. Orson followed her gaze, but all he saw was the endless storm. Still, the tension in the cab was suffocating, as if the shadows themselves were closing in. Minutes dragged by like hours. The truck's heater worked overtime to keep the cold at bay, but Orson's nerves were fraying with every second that passed without the arrival of the police. He checked his phone, but there were no updates. The storm had made the roads treacherous, and help was still miles away. Suddenly, Mia tensed, her body rigid under the oversized jacket. Her eyes locked on something outside, and her breath quickened. "He's here," she whispered, her voice trembling. Orson's heart skipped a beat. "What? Mia, what are you talking about?" She pointed toward the distant edge of the headlight's reach, where the faint outline of a vehicle was just barely visible through the swirling snow. A pair of headlights cut through the storm, growing brighter as the vehicle approached. It was moving slowly, deliberately, as if searching for something or someone. Orson's instincts kicked in. He reached over and turned off the truck's interior lights, plunging the cab into darkness. He leaned forward, squinting through the windshield at the approaching vehicle. It was an old, rusted pickup truck, its paint peeling and its engine growling like a predator stalking its prey. "Is that him?" Orson asked, his voice low. Mia nodded, her face pale. "That's his truck. He found me." Orson's mind raced. He'd dealt with his fair share of road confrontations over the years. Angry drivers, thieves, even the occasional desperate hitchhiker. But this was different. This wasn't about a shipment or a scuffle at a rest stop. This was a child's life on the line. "Stay down," he instructed Mia, his voice firm. "Hide under the dashboard. Don't make a sound." Mia obeyed without hesitation, slipping out of the jacket and curling up in the narrow space beneath the dashboard. Orson grabbed his phone, his thumb hovering over the emergency dial. He glanced at the approaching truck, which had slowed to a crawl, its driver clearly scanning the sides of the highway. The rusted truck came to a stop just a few yards ahead, its engine idling. Orson's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the silhouette of a man step out. The figure was tall and broad, his outline visible through the falling snow. He wore a heavy coat and a wide-brimmed hat, the kind that shielded his face from view. The man stood still for a moment, surveying the area, before taking a few slow steps toward Orson's truck. Orson's grip on his phone tightened. He glanced down at Mia, who was trembling silently in her hiding spot. He knew he had to act fast. This wasn't a confrontation he could avoid. The man was coming closer, his boots crunching against the snow, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Orson took a deep breath, his pulse racing. He rolled down the window slightly, just enough to be heard over the storm, and called out, "Hey, can I help you?" The man paused, his head tilting slightly as if sizing Orson up. When he spoke, his voice was deep and cold, with an edge that sent a shiver down Orson's spine. "Looking for my niece," the man said. "She ran off. Thought I saw her out here." Orson forced himself to stay calm, his expression unreadable. "Haven't seen anyone," he lied. "Just me and the snow out here." The man took another step closer, his face still obscured by the shadows. "Mind if I take a look? She might have climbed in your truck to stay warm." Orson's jaw tightened. He could feel the tension in the air, a silent standoff between two men who both knew there was more at stake than either was letting on. "Sorry, pal," Orson said, his voice firm. "Company policy. No passengers. Besides, if she's out here, she's got a better chance finding shelter in town than freezing on this highway." The man didn't respond immediately. He stood there for a moment, his posture rigid, before taking a slow step back. "Fair enough," he said, though his tone carried a hint of suspicion. "But if you see her, you let me know. She belongs with her family." Orson nodded curtly, watching as the man returned to his truck. The rusted vehicle roared to life, its headlights cutting through the storm as it pulled back onto the highway. Orson waited until the taillights disappeared into the distance before exhaling a shaky breath. He glanced down at Mia, who was peeking out from her hiding spot, her eyes wide with fear. "It's okay," Orson said softly. "He's gone. For now." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew the encounter was far from over. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm brewing in their lives, and as Orson restarted his engine and prepared to face whatever came next, he realized one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't going to let Mia face it alone. The chase begins. The storm showed no signs of letting up as Orson guided his truck back onto the highway, his mind racing as fast as the swirling snow outside. The faint red taillights of the rusted pickup truck had disappeared into the storm, but the tension in the air remained thick, pressing down on him like the weight of the blizzard itself. Mia remained curled under the dashboard, her small body trembling with fear. Orson could see her wide eyes glinting faintly in the dim light of the dashboard controls. She hadn't spoken a word since her uncle had come searching. The terror in her expression made Orson's gut churn with anger. "Listen, Mia," Orson said, his voice low and steady, trying to cut through the storm of her panic. "We're going to get through this. You're safe with me, all right?" Mia didn't respond, but she gave a slight nod, her fingers gripping the edge of his jacket that now served as her blanket. Orson glanced at the rearview mirror, scanning for any sign of the pickup truck. Nothing but darkness and snow. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the man wasn't done looking. The truck's heater blasted warm air, but the chill in the cab was unmistakable. Orson's fingers tightened around the steering wheel, his knuckles pale against the leather. His thoughts raced as he tried to piece together a plan. The nearest town was still miles away, and the police were delayed. He had to stay ahead of Mia's uncle, had to keep her hidden until help arrived. "Do you know if he has a weapon?" Orson asked, his voice careful but firm. "Your uncle. Does he carry anything?" Mia hesitated, her wide eyes flicking toward him. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely audible. "He has a gun." Orson's jaw tightened. Of course, he thought bitterly. The situation was worse than he'd feared. He pressed his foot a little harder on the accelerator, the truck groaning in protest as it pushed through the worsening snow. The roads were slick with ice, and visibility was nearly zero, but stopping wasn't an option. He had to keep moving. "Mia," he said gently, glancing at her again. "Can you tell me more about what happened? Why did you run? Did anyone else know you were planning to leave?" She was silent for a long moment, her small hands clutching the jacket tighter. Then, in a trembling voice, she began to speak. "I tried to tell my teacher," she said, "but she didn't believe me. She said I should talk to my parents. But my parents, they're not there anymore. It's just me and him." Orson felt a pang of sympathy stab through his chest. He didn't press her for details. He could already guess at the kind of horror she'd endured. Instead, he kept his eyes on the road and his voice calm. "You're brave for running, Mia," he said. "That took guts, and I'm going to make sure no one hurts you again, you hear me?" Mia nodded faintly, though her trembling didn't stop. Orson wished he could do more to comfort her, but for now, all he could offer was the warmth of the cab and his promise of safety. As the truck crested a small hill, Orson spotted something in the distance, faint beams of light cutting through the storm. His pulse quickened. At first, he thought it might be the police, finally arriving to help. But as the lights grew closer, his heart sank. It wasn't a squad car. It was the rusted pickup truck. "Damn it," Orson muttered under his breath. Mia stiffened, her fear palpable even without words. She peeked out from under the dashboard, her eyes widening as she saw the approaching lights. "It's him," she whispered, her voice trembling. Orson's mind raced. The pickup was gaining on them, its engine roaring louder as it closed the distance. There was no mistaking the driver's intent. This wasn't a casual search anymore. It was a pursuit. "Stay down," Orson ordered, his voice sharper than before. "Don't move." Mia obeyed instantly, curling back into her hiding spot. Orson's grip on the wheel tightened as he pressed the accelerator to the floor, the truck surging forward. The engine growled in protest, but it held steady, the tires gripping the icy road as best they could. The pickup truck didn't back off. Its headlights loomed larger in the side mirror, the vehicle weaving slightly as it fought against the storm. Orson's heart pounded in his chest. He knew he couldn't outrun the smaller, more agile truck, not in these conditions, but he had one advantage: the weight and power of his rig. The pickup drew closer, its driver flashing the high beams as if to taunt him. Orson squinted against the blinding light, his mind calculating his options. The highway was too narrow for any evasive maneuvers, and the snowbanks on either side made it impossible to pull off the road. He was trapped on a one-way path with a predator at his heels. Then, the pickup swerved sharply, pulling alongside the rig. Orson glanced out the side window, his jaw tightening as he caught a glimpse of the driver's face. The man's features were sharp and cruel, his eyes fixed on Orson with a predatory intensity. He rolled down his window, shouting something that was lost to the wind and snow, but the meaning was clear enough. He wanted Orson to stop. "Not a chance," Orson muttered, his voice a growl. The pickup swerved closer, its tires skidding dangerously close to the rig. Orson felt the impact as the smaller vehicle clipped the side of the trailer, the jolt reverberating through the cab. He gritted his teeth, fighting to keep the truck steady on the icy road. "Mia," he called out, his voice firm but urgent. "Hold on to something." The girl didn't respond, but he felt her presence, huddled tightly in her hiding spot. Orson's mind raced as he tried to anticipate the next move. The pickup was relentless, its driver determined to force him off the road. But Orson wasn't about to let that happen. With a sudden burst of determination, Orson gripped the wheel tightly and swerved the rig slightly toward the pickup. The maneuver was risky. The icy road offered little traction, but it was enough to startle the other driver. The pickup veered away, its tires skidding wildly before it regained control. Orson seized the opportunity. He floored the accelerator, the rig roaring as it surged forward. The pickup fell behind, its smaller engine struggling to keep up. But Orson knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. He had to think fast. Up ahead, the faint outline of a rest area emerged from the storm, its lights flickering dimly through the snow. It wasn't much, but it was the only option. Orson made a quick decision, signaling his turn even though he knew the pickup's driver wouldn't care. He guided the truck toward the rest area, his tires crunching over the snow-covered exit ramp. The rest area was deserted, the parking lot blanketed in fresh snow. Orson pulled the rig into a far corner, killing the headlights and engine. He turned to Mia, his voice urgent but calm. "Stay quiet," he whispered. "No matter what happens, don't make a sound." "Got it." Mia nodded, her eyes wide with fear. Orson reached into the glove compartment, pulling out the only thing he had that could serve as a weapon, a heavy metal flashlight. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The roar of the pickup's engine grew louder as it approached the rest area. Orson gripped the flashlight tightly, his heart pounding as he waited. The storm raged on outside, the wind howling like a living thing. And as the pickup's headlights swept across the lot, Orson braced himself for whatever came next. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a fighter. But for Mia, he was ready to do whatever it took. A battle in the blizzard. The pickup's engine roared like a predator announcing its hunt, cutting through the howling wind and snow. Orson crouched low in the cab of his truck, his knuckles white, as he gripped the heavy metal flashlight. The faint glow of the parking lot lights barely illuminated the rest area, their weak beams swallowed by the storm. The storm mirrored the turmoil raging inside him, raw fear and determination battling for control. In the passenger seat, Mia was silent, her small form trembling beneath his oversized jacket. She clung to the fabric like a lifeline, her wide eyes locked on the window. Orson could feel her terror radiating through the confined space, and it only fueled his resolve. The pickup rolled slowly into the rest area, its headlights sweeping across the lot like searchlights. Orson ducked lower, his breath fogging the glass as he watched. The truck came to a stop a few yards away, its engine idling loudly. The driver's silhouette was barely visible through the storm, but Orson didn't need to see his face to know who it was. This was the man Mia had flawed, the man who had reduced her to a trembling shadow of a child. "Stay here," Orson whispered to Mia, his voice low and firm. "No matter what happens, you don't come out. Understand?" Mia nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. Her fear was palpable, but she didn't argue. Orson gave her a reassuring nod before grabbing the flashlight and slipping out of the truck. The icy wind hit him like a slap, stealing his breath and stinging his exposed skin. Snow clung to his clothes as he crept around the side of the rig, keeping low and out of sight. The pickup's door opened, and the man stepped out, his boots crunching against the snow. He was tall and broad, his coat flapping in the wind like the wings of a predatory bird. His head turned slowly, scanning the lot with a predator's patience. Orson pressed himself against the side of the truck, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The storm worked in his favor, muffling sound and obscuring sight, but it also made every movement treacherous. "You can't hide her forever," the man called out, his voice cutting through the wind like a blade. "She's mine. She belongs with me." Orson's stomach churned at the possessiveness in the man's tone. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, the cold metal biting into his palm. Every instinct screamed at him to stay hidden, to wait for the police to arrive. But the man's words, and the raw fear in Mia's eyes, pushed him into action. "I don't think so," Orson shouted back, his voice steady despite the storm. He stepped out from behind the truck, the flashlight held like a weapon in his hand. "She's not going anywhere with you." The man's head snapped toward Orson, his face partially obscured by the brim of his hat and the falling snow. He took a slow step forward, his posture tense but confident. "Don't be stupid," he said. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into." Orson squared his shoulders, planting his feet firmly in the snow. He knew he was outmatched. This man was bigger, stronger, and probably armed. But Orson also knew what was at stake. He wasn't just protecting Mia. He was standing against the kind of evil he couldn't ignore. "I've been called stupid before," Orson said, his voice laced with defiance. "But I'm not letting you hurt her." The man let out a low chuckle, the sound devoid of humor. "You're making a mistake, trucker. This doesn't have to get ugly." Orson didn't flinch. "It already is." The man's smile disappeared, replaced by a cold, predatory stare. He reached into his coat, and Orson's heart skipped a beat as he saw the glint of metal, a gun. The storm seemed to hold its breath as the man pulled the weapon free, pointing it directly at Orson. "Walk away," the man said, his voice a low growl. "This isn't your fight." Orson's mind raced. He couldn't match a gun with a flashlight, but he couldn't back down either. The man's attention was on him, which meant Mia was still safe. He just needed to keep it that way until the police arrived. "I think you're the one who should walk away," Orson said, stalling for time. He took a slow step back, careful not to make any sudden movements. "The cops are on their way. You don't want to be here when they show up." The man's eyes narrowed, his grip on the gun tightening. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Orson said, forcing a smirk. "You've already lost, pal. Go home while you still can." For a moment, the man hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the road as if calculating his chances. Then, with a sudden burst of anger, he raised the gun higher, his finger tightening on the trigger. Orson didn't think. He moved. He swung the flashlight with all his strength, the metal colliding with the man's arm in a dull thud. The gun went off, the shot ringing out like a thunderclap in the storm. But the angle was off, and the bullet buried itself harmlessly in the snow. The man let out a roar of pain, clutching his arm as Orson swung again, this time aiming for his head. The flashlight connected, and the man staggered back, his hat flying off into the snow. Orson didn't stop. He couldn't. He lunged forward, knocking the gun from the man's hand and sending it skidding across the lot. They grappled in the snow, the storm whipping around them like a furious spectator. Orson's size gave him an advantage, but the man was relentless, his strength fueled by rage. They tumbled to the ground, fists and knees flying as they fought for control. Through the chaos, Orson caught a glimpse of headlights cutting through the storm. For a split second, he thought it was the police, but the lights were too far away, too stationary. It wasn't help. Not yet. The man landed a solid punch to Orson's ribs, knocking the wind out of him. Orson gasped, his vision blurring as he struggled to stay conscious. The man's hand closed around his throat, squeezing with brutal force. "You should have stayed out of this," the man snarled, his face inches from Orson's. "Now you're gonna pay." Orson's vision darkened, the edges of the world fading into shadow. But then, through the haze, he heard a sound, a faint voice, high-pitched and trembling. "Leave him alone, Mia." The man froze, his grip loosening just enough for Orson to shove him off. He rolled onto his side, coughing and gasping for air, as the man turned toward the source of the voice. Maya stood by the truck, her small frame silhouetted against the storm. She was holding something in her hands, something shiny and metallic. The gun. Orson's heart lurched as he realized what she was holding. "Mia, put it down," he shouted, his voice hoarse but urgent. The man's eyes narrowed, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "You don't even know how to use that, kid." Mia's hand shook, but she didn't lower the weapon. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried through the storm like a battle cry. "Try me." The storm roared on, a witness to a battle far from over. The storm breaks. The snowstorm seemed to hold its breath, the howling wind muffled by the tension crackling in the air. Maya stood just a few feet from the truck, her tiny hands gripping the heavy gun with trembling resolve. The barrel wavered slightly, but her wide eyes were fixed on her uncle, her fear slowly hardening into defiance. "Mia," Orson croaked, struggling to his feet. His chest heaved as he caught his breath, his ribs screaming in pain from the fight. "Put it down, kid. You don't need to do this." Her gaze flickered to Orson, then back to her uncle. She didn't lower the weapon. Instead, she took a shaky step forward, the snow crunching beneath her bare feet. "Stay away from him," she said, her voice trembling but loud enough to carry over the storm. "You don't get to hurt people anymore." Her uncle's lips curled into a cruel smile, his hands raised slightly in mock surrender. "Mia, put the gun down," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You're not going to shoot me. You're just a scared little girl." "I'm not scared of you anymore," Maya shot back, though her voice quavered with the effort of standing her ground. Orson stepped between them, his broad frame partially shielding Mia. He raised his hands, trying to de-escalate the situation, while keeping himself between the girl and her predator. "She's not alone," Orson said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "You're done, pal. The cops are on their way. It's over." The man's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He glanced over his shoulder at the road, the distant wail of sirens barely audible over the storm. His eyes darted back to Orson, and for a moment, the rage in his expression faltered. Then, like a cornered animal, he lunged toward Mia. Orson reacted instinctively, throwing himself into the man's path. They collided with a sickening thud, the force sending them both sprawling into the snow. The gun flew from Mia's hands, skidding across the icy ground. She let out a sharp cry, stumbling backward as the two men grappled once more. The snow muffled the sounds of their struggle, the storm enveloping them in a white, swirling void. Orson fought with everything he had, his body screaming in protest as he blocked punches and threw his weight against the larger man. But his opponent was relentless, his rage giving him strength that Orson could barely match. "You should have stayed out of this," the man roared, his voice raw with fury. "And let you ruin her life." Orson snarled back, his fist connecting with the man's jaw. "Not a chance." Mia watched in horror, her small frame frozen as the fight unfolded. Then her eyes darted to the gun, half buried in the snow a few feet away. She hesitated, her breathing shallow as she weighed her options. Finally, she took a deep breath and darted forward, her bare feet slipping on the ice as she grabbed the weapon. She didn't aim it this time. Instead, she turned and ran toward the truck, clutching the gun tightly to her chest. Orson caught a glimpse of her out of the corner of his eye and felt a surge of relief. She was getting out of harm's way. "Mia, get in the truck," he shouted, his voice strained as he wrestled with her uncle. She obeyed, climbing into the cab and slamming the door shut. The sound of the lock clicking into place was a small victory, but Orson knew the fight wasn't over. The man beneath him bucked wildly, throwing him off and scrambling to his feet. "You think this is over?" The man spat, his breath visible in the freezing air. "You're dead, trucker." Orson didn't answer. He lunged forward, tackling the man again and driving him into the snow. The impact jarred his already aching ribs, but he didn't let go. He pinned the man down with every ounce of strength he had left, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, the flashing blue and red lights finally cutting through the storm. Orson's heart leaped at the sight. Help was here. They weren't alone anymore. The man beneath him thrashed violently, his curses drowned out by the approaching police cars. Orson held on, his grip unrelenting even as his muscles screamed in protest. "Stay down," Orson growled. "It's over." The first squad car skidded to a stop, its tires crunching against the icy pavement. Two officers jumped out, their weapons drawn as they approached. "Hands where we can see them," one of the officers shouted, his voice commanding. Orson let go, rolling off the man and raising his hands in surrender. The officers moved quickly, pinning the man to the ground and snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. He screamed and thrashed, but his struggles were futile against their combined strength. As the officers hauled him to his feet, Orson collapsed onto his back, staring up at the swirling snowflakes. His body ached, his ribs felt like they were on fire, but relief washed over him like a wave. It was finally over. Another officer approached Orson, her face lined with concern. "Sir, are you all right?" "I've been better," Orson admitted, his voice hoarse. He pointed toward the truck. "There's a little girl in the cab. She's the one he was after." The officer nodded, motioning for her partner to check on Mia. The partner approached the truck cautiously, tapping on the window. Mia hesitated, her small face peeking out from behind the curtain of Orson's jacket. When she saw the uniform, her fear melted into tears of relief. She unlocked the door, and the officer helped her out, wrapping her in a thick blanket. "You're safe now," the officer said softly, her voice soothing. "We've got you." Mia nodded, her tears soaking into the blanket as she clung to the officer. Orson watched from the ground, his heart swelling with pride and relief. He had done it. He had kept her safe. As the officers loaded the man into the squad car, Orson pulled himself to his feet, wincing at the sharp pain in his side. He leaned against the truck, his breath fogging in the cold air. Maya ran to him, her small arms wrapping around his waist in a tight hug. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice muffled against his jacket. Orson rested a hand on her head, his throat tight with emotion. "You're welcome, kid." The storm began to ease, the wind dying down and the snow falling in gentle flakes. The chaos of the night had passed, leaving a quiet, fragile peace in its wake. As the police cars pulled away, their lights fading into the distance, Orson stood beside Mia, the two of them watching the storm break. For the first time in years, Orson felt a sense of purpose, a feeling that he had done something that truly mattered. And as he guided Mia back into the truck, ready to take her to a safer place, he knew one thing for certain. Sometimes the road you take isn't about where you're going. It's about who you're willing to protect along the way.